Hi everybody, Bryce here, and I'm talking about language, gender, and variation in Oklahoma using my self-constructed corpus. So what I'm going to talk about today in this little PowerPoint, which I'll be also getting away from here and there to talk about some concordances and some of the write-ups from this week that are relevant to my presentation. But we'll go over an introduction to what I'm doing, talk about rationale, brief methodology, and then a little bit about some of the preliminary results that I found, and then I'll talk about where I think I'll be going with this project next. So, introducing to this topic, so trying to describe what I'm doing or what I'm interested in, it starts off with the question, do men and women talk differently? Now, some of us have taken language and gender courses, and we know that that question is loaded and complex and has um, sensitive answers to it, but we're talking about non-linguist attitudes towards whether or not men and women talk differently. And so, from what I've seen in the rodeo data, people do tend to have ideas about what women do when they speak versus what men do when they speak, and that's not necessarily to say that this is scientifically true, but rather that people have ideas about it. So then the question is, what makes speech masculine or what makes speech feminine? So for those speakers in this data set, um, who are all gay men, then do they have ways of characterizing masculine speech versus feminine speech, or calling a certain kind of speech masculine or feminine? And then finally, what do speakers' ideas about these ways of talking tell us about their language attitudes? And it's sort of bigger than that too, but I'll get into the implications near the end of this. So, research questions are there trends for the ways gay men talk about gender and language in Oklahoma? Do these trends highlight language attitudes or realities for them in Oklahoma? And can we hypothesize similarities or differences between these and non-gay Oklahomans? So I'll break this down because that might sound like really convoluted. The first is just, okay, like, is everyone doing something different when they're asked about whether or not men and women talk the same, or whenever they describe Oklahoma language? Or are there tendencies or patterns in the ways they do that? The second question means, is there are what they describe as masculine or feminine, or certain speech styles as sounding masculine or feminine, does that reflect experiences they've had in Oklahoma, or does that reflect attitudes held by other Oklahomans? And then finally, can we hypothesize similarities or differences between these and non-gay Oklahomans? Then that might say we might hypothesize that gay men are more likely to resist um, gender expectations with language. Or, I mean, depending on what you've seen, you might actually hypothesize that they will perpetuate the same gender expectations in Oklahoma. So that's what's guiding this. The rationale, so this project contributes to rodeo, which is important in itself. It also contributes to studies in gender, studies in identity, and studies in Oklahoma language. And that's really important, especially with studies in identity and gender that are focusing on uh, people of the LGBT community. And that's largely the case because there's just a lack of research on it. Now, it is the pool of research on LGBT peoples and their lives is growing, but certainly nothing has been done that I've seen in this vein. Another avenue of importance for this research is language attitudes. Language attitudes are important just in themselves, as we know, but also they're important for their potential to highlight sociocultural realities or possibilities. Now, I've mentioned that twice, so I'll go ahead and explain what I mean by that. Is that you could think of a hypothetical situation in which a gay man calls gay speech feminine, um, and yet there might not be any connection to what is feminine there. And so it tends to fit the general stereotyping or generalization of gay men as less masculine and therefore more feminine. So if that is the case, then that means that Oklahomans are not only, even gay Oklahomans are not only uh, prone to ignoring uh, these stereotypical ideas about gay men, but that they're prone to being susceptible to them as well. But of course, that's complicated interpretations and discussions that should come after research has been finished, and which it has not. So I will move on to methods. So they were this. All my data came from rodeo interviews. There's two different interviews. One that has to do with being from Oklahoma and having family in Oklahoma, and one that moves in to questions about being gay. And that section, the second interview, actually starts off with a question of whether or not men and women sound differently or the same here in Oklahoma. The interviews were transcribed. I took old transcripts from projects I've done before. The most recent of which was one on creaky voice from these speakers, which will show up actually in this data set because I left the tagging system for that in my transcript, so I can show you guys. I think it actually looks kind of cool when I'm able to search with that in mind. They went through several rounds of revisions because I had to cut out the interviewer's text or the text representative of the interviewer's questions and responses. They were converted and worked on even up to this morning when I was working on this, so they could be used in ant-conc and casual conc, and then I just observed some general findings. So here's a little spreadsheet or screenshot of a spreadsheet, and you can see there's double names for each one because that counts for both interviews, and I have the interview times here. The spreadsheet is quite long. It goes way this way because I have information about creaky voice occurrences or intonation units, which you can see total I use here, as well as the responses to the questions that just like it's shorthand notes for that. But yeah, so the age range to point out here, 23, there's two 23-year-olds, two 24-year-olds, two 25-year-olds, a 27-year-old, a 28-year-old, and a 33-year-old. So I'm actually pretty happy with the age range. I think that it's a pretty good range. We've got a lot of young, early 20s here, which I think is important. But you'd be surprised. One thing I won't talk about today, but that I found was that everyone uses emphatic like. In fact, it's ubiquitous across this data set, and it's really interesting that from 33 to 23, across a 10-year age gap, there's virtually no difference in the usage of emphatic like. That's where someone says something along the lines of, I would really like you to, pay attention to this presentation. Where like comes before pay attention to this presentation to emphasize that that's an important part of my statement. And all of these guys do things like that, which I think is really interesting. Alright, so to casual conc for some preliminary stuff. So here, this actually has to do with what I did for this week. Notice that I have a search for gay here, but we can ignore that for right now. For our collocates homework, we had to look up nouns. Now, I recognize that the frequency here is much lower than what we were asked to do, but of course I'm working with a specialized corpus with a much smaller amount of data, which is problematic, and I wish that I could have more, but that will take time. But in any case, I looked at this, and it brought me to some interesting thoughts. So here's this write-up. Look here. I also made this cool little word cloud of words that tend to occur with Oklahoma. We have Oklahoma, Oklahoman, and gay or Oklahoma City. Here in Oklahoma, how did your family come to Oklahoma? So their family, they've come here before. Well, we see all those there. But the collocation really is what gave me more insight. So once I had looked at Oklahoma and saw that some of this stuff was happening, I think that you might have noticed here that women is on this list, but men is not. So that made me think, well, gay is obviously an important word too. It would seem silly of me not to look that up. And so I just did a few searches. Here's just a general word count list too, which I think is also pretty interesting. So back to this. When I looked up gay, this is the co-occurrence spreadsheet here. You can see there's a lot of words that occur here and there. By the way, this leaving the creaky voice tags in here was actually pretty cool because there were some pretty neat tendencies that I was able to look at, but I don't really have time to talk about that today, so ask me about it sometime. And that led me to see, well, where does gay line up with men? Because we saw that women was a word, a colloquy for Oklahoma, but men wasn't. So I thought, well, how often, what are some tendencies we can see with men? And sure enough, gay has found 77 instances within 8 files, whereas men was found 25 in 7 files. So that's interesting. We might expect gay to occur more because these are gay men talking about being gay in Oklahoma, but they are also men, so you would think that you would expect men to be up there. So it's interesting that when we compare men to women, we see that women actually only have 20 instances of the word found within 6 files. Not an incredible difference, but certainly it is different. There's a lower amount, maybe not statistically significant, but it's something to notice, right? Especially when I looked at the difference between masculine versus feminine. Only 12 instances within 5 files for masculine, with 29 and 6 files for feminine. So this led me to a few other questions. In terms of content, we see men is more occurs more than women, but feminine occurs more than masculine. So this isn't surprising, and what I mean by that is that anyone who studied research on gay men in Oklahoma, like me, knows that gay men do typically characterize gay speech as being feminine. However, the discussion of what is feminine speech rarely comes up. Often pitch and content are used as indicators of femininity within speech, but those are rarely ascribed to women Oklahomans or female Oklahomans. So the next step in this, after seeing some of these patterns and general numbers, is to look at some of the answers that they gave. For example, I have, not that. For this write-up that we did, I noted that some, well, you don't need to read that. I noted that some Oklahomans, so let's say out of 5 instances of the word Oklahoma City, 2 were just geographical reference in terms of how far away from the city they were. 2 were instances of trying to talk positively about the city, although I will admit that the way that it was talked about, the context in which the positive comments were made, were also under the assumption that you might think that Oklahoma City is not a good place to go, or not a fun place to go, or not a progressive place to go. And then the last instance was just a general disdain for the city, saying that Oklahoma City was the biggest city that we have, which is pretty sad. And so looking at that, so there we have like a tripart or 3 different ways of talking about it out of the 5 instances of Oklahoma City occurring. And so moving in that direction will probably be what I do next. Hopefully getting some more, because it was actually doing that led me to comparing lists like these. So hopefully I'll still get some good ideas as I go through looking at more like qualitative aspects of what's going on. But yeah, anyway, thanks for watching. Really appreciate your time, and let me know what you think.